At 700 on January 24, 1945, a man weighing 120 pounds made a decision that military historians would debate for the next 8 decades. He picked up a telephone, grabbed 400 yards of wire, and walked directly toward 600 German soldiers and 6 Tiger tanks. What happened next would kill over 150 enemy combatants, destroy every single tank in the German formation, and save an entire American battalion from annihilation. The man who did this was not a general. He was not a decorated officer from West Point. He was a tobacco farmer from Kentucky who never finished high school. His name was Garland Merle Connor. He stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, and on that frozen morning in France, he would commit what his own commanders called suicide. But here is the part that nobody expected. He survived. And the method he used to survive was so insane, so completely against every military protocol ever written, that the Army initially refused to give him the Medal of Honor. They said what he did was impossible. They said no man could have done what the witnesses described. It took 73 years, a federal lawsuit, and the testimony of soldiers who watched him do it before the truth finally came out. This is the story of how one man called artillery fire on his own position for 3 consecutive hours and lived to tell absolutely no one about it. The winter of 1945 was the coldest in European memory. American soldiers on the Western Front called it the frozen hell. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees below zero. Snow covered everything. Men slept in foxholes carved from frozen earth if they slept at all. The German army had launched Operation Nordwind on New Year's Day, their last major offensive in the West. While the Battle of the Bulge raged 300 miles to the north, another desperate fight was unfolding in a forgotten corner of France called the Colmar Pocket. The Colmar Pocket was 850 square miles of frozen forest and farmland west of the Rhine River. It was the last piece of France that Germany still controlled. Every attempt to eliminate it had failed. The French First Army had lost thousands of men trying to push the Germans back across the Rhine. The Americans had sent reinforcements. Still, the pocket held. The German 19th Army was trapped inside, and trapped armies fight with the desperation of cornered animals. They knew surrender meant Soviet prison camps. They knew retreat meant execution by the SS. So they fought. They launched counterattacks. They probed American lines every night. They killed and died in the frozen darkness because dying in battle was better than the alternatives. 3rd Battalion 7th Infantry Regiment held a section of the front line north of the pocket. They had been there for 18 days. 43 men had died in 2 weeks, most of them from artillery and sniper fire. The survivors were exhausted, frostbitten, running low on ammunition and hope. And on the morning of January 24th, German reconnaissance aircraft spotted a weakness in their line. The left flank was undermanned. A breakthrough there would collapse the entire American position. The German commanders assembled a strike force that would have terrified any defender. 6 Tiger tanks. These were not ordinary tanks. The Tiger was a 60-ton monster with 100 millimeters of frontal armor. American 75-millimeter guns bounced off them like rubber balls. American bazookas were jokes against them. The only thing that could reliably kill a Tiger was another Tiger, and the Americans did not have any. Behind the tanks came 600 infantry soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad, and Kursk men who knew exactly how to assault fortified positions. They moved through the forest in squad formations, professional, methodical, absolutely deadly. The attack was scheduled for 07:15. The Germans expected to break through within 2 hours. They expected to roll up the American flank and circle 3rd Battalion and open a gap that would allow the entire 19th Army to escape the Colmar Pocket. What they did not expect was a 120-pound farmer with a telephone. Garland Merle Connor was born in 1919 in Clinton County, Kentucky. His family worked a farm on Indian Creek, growing tobacco and corn the same way their ancestors had for generations. The nearest school was 15 miles away. Connor walked when he could. Most days he could not. He dropped out before finishing high school because the farm needed him more than he needed algebra. He grew up understanding that survival meant hard work, that nature did not care about your complaints, that you either solved your problems or your problem solved you. He enlisted in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. By January 1945, he had served 4 years, fought in 10 major campaigns, participated in 4 amphibious assault landings, and been wounded 7 times. The last wound had sent him to the hospital 3 weeks earlier. Shrapnel in his hip. The doctors told him to stay in bed for 6 weeks. He left after 2. He returned to 3rd Battalion on January 22nd, 2 days before the German attack. His official role was intelligence officer. Intelligence officers gathered information about enemy movements. They interrogated prisoners. They analyzed patrol reports and marked German positions on maps. They stayed behind the front line. They worked with papers and pencils, not rifles and grenades. But Connor had never stayed behind the front line. He had earned 4 silver stars for direct combat action. Each medal represented a moment when Connor had ignored his job description and done something that saved other soldiers' lives. His commanders had learned something about this quiet Kentucky farmer. When the situation turned desperate, Connor moved forward. At 07:15, the German artillery barrage began. Shells walked across 3rd Battalion's forward positions. Trees exploded. Dirt and frozen earth fountained into the gray sky. The barrage lasted 12 minutes. Then silence. Then the sound that every American soldier dreaded. Tank engines. A runner burst into the command post with the news. Germans advancing. 6 Tigers. Hundreds of infantry moving through the woods toward the left flank. The battalion commander studied his map and understood immediately that his men were about to die. There were no American tanks in position to stop the Tigers, no tank destroyers, no air support in the overcast weather. The only weapon that could possibly stop the German attack was artillery, but artillery needed a forward observer. Someone who could see the Germans advancing. Someone who could adjust the fire onto the targets. The forward observation post had been destroyed by the barrage. The observers were dead or wounded. No one in the command post could see the German advance. The trees blocked everything. Without eyes on the enemy, the artillery would fire blind. Blind fire meant wasted shells landing on empty forest while the Tigers rolled through American foxholes. The battalion commander was still staring at the map when Connor picked up a telephone and 400 yards of wire. He looked at his commander. Then he walked out of the command post into the snow. 400 yards of open ground separated the command post from the front line. 400 yards of frozen earth, with no cover, no concealment, nothing but white snow and gray sky and German artillery observers watching every movement. Connor ran. The telephone wire unspooled behind him. He carried the spool in his left hand, the handset in his right. His boots broke through the snow crust with each step. At 100 yards, the German guns found him. A shell landed 40 yards to his left, then 30 yards to his right. The Germans were adjusting. They could see a lone American soldier sprinting toward their attack. They wanted him dead. A shell hit a tree 70 yards ahead. The tree exploded into splinters and frozen fragments. Connor kept running. Another shell 20 yards behind him. The concussion wave hit him like a fist. He stumbled but did not fall. At 250 yards, a shell destroyed a tree directly in his path. The trunk split down the middle. Half of it crashed across the snow. Connor vaulted over the wreckage without breaking stride. Shrapnel hissed in the snow around him. Another shell 15 yards to his left. Frozen dirt geysered up. The blast hammered his eardrums until he could hear nothing but ringing. He reached the American front line at 300 yards. Soldiers crouched in foxholes stared at him. An intelligence officer running toward the German advance with a telephone. They thought he had lost his mind. He did not stop to explain. 30 yards beyond the American foxholes, Connor found what he needed. A shallow ditch maybe 18 inches deep. Not deep enough to stop bullets. Not deep enough to protect against artillery. But deep enough to give him a sight line toward the German advance while keeping his silhouette below the snow level. He dropped into the ditch. The telephone wire had held. He cranked the handset. The connection buzzed. Then a voice came through the artillery fire direction center 3 miles behind the front line. American 105mm howitzers. 12 guns. Enough firepower to shatter a German attack if the shells landed in the right place. Connor gave his position. The fire direction officer confirmed. Connor was now the eyes of 3rd Battalion's artillery. Everything depended on what he could see and whether he could stay alive long enough to direct the guns. He raised his head above the ditch rim. The German infantry were 200 yards away, moving through the trees in squad formations, rifles at the ready. Behind them, the Tigers. Connor could see 4 of the massive machines pushing through the smaller trees like they were saplings. They were coming. Slow, methodical, unstoppable. And they were heading directly toward him. Connor lifted the handset. He gave the coordinates. Fire mission. Enemy infantry in the open. The first shells would arrive in 40 seconds. If the Germans spotted him before the shells landed, they would kill him before he could adjust the fire. If the shells landed too close to his position, they would kill him anyway. If the shells landed too far from the German advance, the attack would continue, and 3rd Battalion would cease to exist. Connor watched the Germans advance. He counted the seconds. 38, 39, 40. The sky screamed. The first salvo landed 150 yards behind the German infantry. Too far. Connor grabbed the handset. Drop 100. Fire for effect. The German infantry kept advancing. They had not reacted to the shells. Artillery landing behind an attack was normal. It meant the defenders were guessing. But Connor was not guessing. He could see every German soldier, every movement, every squad leader signaling his men forward. The second salvo arrived 18 seconds later. This time the shells landed in the middle of the German formation. The forest erupted. Trees disintegrated. Shrapnel screamed through the air. 12 105mm shells, each carrying 14 pounds of high explosive, detonating simultaneously among 600 men packed into attack formations. German soldiers disappeared. Others went down screaming. The advance stopped. Connor cranked the handset. Repeat fire, same coordinates. Another salvo. Then another. The American guns were firing for effect now. Maximum rate of fire. 4 rounds per minute per gun. 48 shells every 60 seconds, hammering the same 200 square yards of forest. The German infantry scattered. Squad formations broke apart. Soldiers dove behind trees. Others tried to crawl away from the impact zone. But the Tigers were still coming. Connor could see all 6 now. They had broken out of the tree line into open ground. The artillery had not touched them. 105 shells could damage a Tiger's tracks or optics, but they could not penetrate the armor. The tanks advanced in a wedge formation, and they were heading straight for Connor's ditch. One of the Tigers fired. The 88mm gun cracked like thunder. An American foxhole exploded. 3 soldiers dead in an instant. Another Tiger fired. Another foxhole obliterated. The Tigers were 300 yards from the American line. In 4 minutes, they would reach the foxholes. And then, 3rd Battalion would die. Connor had one option left. It was the option that every artillery manual said never to use. It was the option that meant almost certain death. He lifted the handset and spoke 3 words that would echo through military history. Fire on my position. Fire on my position. 3 words that violated every artillery manual ever written. 3 words that meant death for the man who spoke them. The fire direction officer 3 miles behind the front line heard the coordinates and stopped breathing. He asked Connor to repeat. Connor repeated. The officer asked him to confirm a 3rd time. This was not standard procedure. This was suicide by friendly fire. Connor confirmed for the 3rd time. His voice was calm. His voice was steady. His voice belonged to a man who had already accepted that he might not survive the next 40 seconds. The shells were coming. 12 105mm rounds screaming through the frozen air toward the exact spot where Garland Merle Connor lay in an 18-inch ditch with nothing but a telephone, and the absolute certainty that if he did not do this, Every man in 3rd Battalion would die. This is part 2 of the story of how a Kentucky tobacco farmer held off 600 German soldiers and 6 Tiger tanks for 3 hours by calling artillery on his own head. And what happened next would push the limits of human endurance beyond anything the Army had ever documented. The first shells landed 30 yards in front of Connor's ditch. The concussion wave felt like being hit by a truck traveling at 60 miles per hour. The air pressure changed so violently that his lungs compressed inside his chest. His vision blurred. Frozen dirt and shrapnel screamed overhead, passing through the space where his head would have been if he had raised it 6 inches higher. The sound was beyond thunder. It was beyond anything human ears were designed to process. It was the sound of the world ending 30 yards away. Connor stayed in the ditch. He kept the handset pressed to his ear. He could feel his heart slamming against his ribs. He could taste copper in his mouth, blood from his bitten tongue. But he was alive, and the Germans had stopped advancing. The Tiger commanders had buttoned up their hatches. Even inside 60 tons of armored steel, they did not want to be exposed when American shells were detonating at point-blank range. The tank commanders could not see properly with their hatches closed. The vision blocks were small, limited, designed for protection rather than visibility. Connor had bought himself seconds. But seconds were not enough. The German infantry was rallying. Connor raised his head just enough to see over the ditch rim. 200 soldiers who had survived the initial barrage were forming up again. They were using the Tigers for cover, staying behind the massive tanks, moving when the tanks moved. The attack was continuing. Connor grabbed the handset. Drop 20. Repeat fire. The next salvo landed 20 yards from his position. Close enough that he could feel the heat from the explosions on his face. Close enough that shrapnel tore through the air 6 feet above his head. If he stood up, he would be shredded into pieces too small to identify. If the shells landed 10 yards closer, the ditch would not save him. But the artillery was working. The German infantry scattered again. Men dove into shell craters. Others crawled backward toward the tree line. The coordinated assault was breaking apart into individual survival. But the Tigers kept coming. 3 of them were still fully operational, and they had adjusted their course. They were no longer heading toward the American foxholes. They were heading directly toward Connor's ditch. The tank commanders had spotted his position. They had seen the telephone wire running across the snow. They understood that one man was directing all the American artillery, and they were coming to kill him. Connor checked the ditch again. 18 inches of frozen earth. Not enough to stop an 88mm tank shell. Not enough to stop the machine gun fire from a Tiger's bow gunner. Not enough to stop anything the Germans could throw at him. The tanks were 150 yards away now, close enough that Connor could see the Balkenkreuz markings on their turrets. Close enough to see the frost on their armor plating. Close enough to see death rolling toward him at 15 miles per hour. He lifted the handset one more time and spoke words that should have been his last. Fire on my position. Adjust fire. Bring it closer. The fire direction officer's voice cracked when he acknowledged the command. Connor could hear the man's fear through the static. Everyone in that fire direction center knew they were about to kill an American officer. They fired anyway. Because Connor ordered them to. Because Connor was the only man who could see what was happening. Because Connor understood something that the men 3 miles behind the line could not understand. If he died, and the artillery stopped, everyone died. If he died and the artillery kept falling on the German formation, 3rd Battalion might survive. The math was simple. 1 life against hundreds. The shells landed 15 yards in front of the ditch. The blast lifted Connor's body off the frozen ground. He slammed back down hard enough to crack ribs. Dirt cascaded into the ditch, filling his mouth, his nose, his eyes. He could not breathe. He could not see. He could not hear anything except a high-pitched ringing that drowned out the entire world. But his hand still gripped the telephone. His fingers still worked. He wiped the dirt from his eyes with his free hand and looked toward the German advance. The lead Tiger had stopped. A shell had hit directly in front of it, and the driver had lost his nerve. The tank sat motionless in the impact zone, while its commander screamed orders through the intercom. The other two Tigers were still advancing, but they had slowed. Their commanders were watching the artillery fall. They were calculating the odds of driving through a barrage that was landing within yards of their target. Connor called another fire mission. Same coordinates. Maximum rate of fire. He wanted those tanks buried in explosions. He wanted their commanders to understand that every yard they advanced would cost them. The American guns responded, 48 shells per minute hammering the same 100 square yards of frozen French farmland. The noise was continuous now. Not individual explosions, but a single rolling thunder that shook the earth and turned the air into a fog of smoke and dirt and flying metal. A shell hit the second Tiger's right track. The track snapped. The tank slewed hard and stopped, immobilized but still dangerous. Its turret traversed toward the American foxholes. The 88mm gun was still operational. A disabled Tiger with a working gun was still a fortress that could kill from 1,000 yards. Connor shifted fire onto the immobilized tank. 3 shells landed around it in rapid succession. 1 hit the engine deck. Smoke began pouring from the rear of the vehicle. The crew might abandon it, or they might stay and fight. Connor did not wait to find out. He shifted fire again to the last advancing Tiger. This tank was 60 yards from the American line now, close enough that its machine guns were ripping through the defensive positions. Soldiers in the foxholes were dying. Connor could hear their screams between the artillery impacts. He could hear American voices calling for medics, calling for help, calling for someone to stop the tank that was about to roll over them. Connor gave the coordinates. He specified the exact position of the Tiger. The shells landed around the tank in a perfect bracket. 1 shell hit the turret ring. The impact did not penetrate the armor, but it jammed the traverse mechanism. The turret would not rotate anymore. The Tiger could only fire straight ahead. The tank commander realized his vehicle was effectively useless for combat. He ordered the driver to reverse. The Tiger began backing away from the American line. Connor watched the retreat through eyes burning with dirt and smoke. All 6 Tigers were now destroyed, disabled, or withdrawing. The armored spearhead of the German attack had been broken by one man with a telephone. But the battle was not over. 400 German infantry soldiers were still alive. They were scattered across 300 yards of cratered forest, hiding in shell holes, crouching behind fallen trees, waiting for the artillery to stop so they could resume their advance. And Connor was running out of time. The fire direction officer reported that the artillery battery had 15 minutes of ammunition remaining. After that, the guns would go silent while the crews reloaded. 15 minutes without artillery support. The Germans would use that window to reorganize. They would mass for one final assault. And without Connor's observed fire, that assault might succeed. The battalion commander came on the radio net. He ordered Connor to withdraw, fall back to the American foxholes. The artillery would lay down covering fire. Connor could make it back alive. Connor refused. From his position in the ditch, he could see the entire German formation. He could see every attempt to rally, every movement, every NCO trying to gather his scattered squad. If he withdrew, the Americans would lose their forward observer. The artillery would fire blind. The Germans would exploit the gap. Connor stayed in the ditch. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero. Connor had been lying in frozen earth for over an hour. His hands were numb. His feet were numb. Every time a shell landed close, dirt rained down on him. It got in his eyes, in his mouth, between his fingers. The telephone handset was slippery with ice and blood from his torn palms. But he kept calling fire. A German squad tried to advance from the left. Connor dropped shells on them. Another squad tried to flank from the right. Connor adjusted fire and killed them. A company-sized formation attempted a coordinated rush. Connor called fire for effect and watched them disappear in a storm of explosions. The Germans were learning. Every time they moved, the American artillery found them. Every time they tried to organize, shells landed in their midst. They began to understand that someone was watching them. Someone who could see every movement they made. someone who would not stop killing them until they retreated or died. The German artillery observers finally pinpointed Connor's position. They had watched the pattern of American fire. They had traced it back to its source. German shells began falling around the ditch, 20 yards behind, then 15, then 10. The Germans were walking their fire toward him, trying to kill the man who was destroying their attack. Connor found himself caught between two artillery barrages, American shells landing in front of him, German shells landing behind him. The ditch had become the focal point of two armies trying to kill each other with high explosives. Soldiers in 3rd Battalion's foxholes could see what was happening. They watched a lone lieutenant lying in a shallow depression, surrounded by explosions from both sides, somehow still alive, somehow still calling fire. They had never seen anything like it. They would never see anything like it again. Connor called counter-battery fire. He gave the estimated coordinates of the German artillery positions. The American guns shifted targets and began hammering the German howitzers 3 miles behind the enemy front line. The German artillery fire slackened. Then it stopped. The German gun crews were taking cover or dying under American shells. Connor shifted fire back to the infantry. He had maybe 10 minutes of ammunition left. 10 minutes to break the German attack completely. 10 minutes to make sure they never came back. A German officer rallied 80 soldiers for one final push. They came from multiple directions, simultaneously trying to overwhelm Connor's ability to adjust fire. They were 30 yards away when Connor called the final coordinates. Danger close. Shells landing between him and the advancing Germans. The explosions killed the officer, killed 40 of his men, scattered the rest. The surviving Germans began retreating. They dragged their wounded toward the tree line. They left their dead where they had fallen. The attack was over. Connor stayed in the ditch for another 20 minutes, watching, making sure the Germans were not regrouping, making sure no follow-up attack was coming. When he finally stood up, his legs barely supported him. 3 hours in frozen earth. His muscles had locked. His joints refused to bend properly. But he was alive. And 3rd Battalion was alive. Because one man had done what every military manual said was impossible. The battlefield fell silent. No engine sounds, no rifle fire, no explosions, just wind moving through shattered trees. And somewhere in the tree line, the sound of German voices calling for help. But the story does not end here. Because what Connor did that day would remain buried for 53 years. Hidden in a cardboard box, forgotten by everyone except the men who watched him do it. And the reason it stayed hidden reveals something about Garland Merle Connor that was even more remarkable than his courage under fire. In Part 1, you watched a 120-pound tobacco farmer from Kentucky run 400 yards through German artillery fire with nothing but a telephone and a spool of wire. In Part 2, you watched him call artillery on his own position for 3 consecutive hours, destroying 6 Tiger tanks and killing over 150 German soldiers while lying in an 18-inch ditch that should have been his grave. 3rd Battalion survived. The German counterattack failed. The Colmar pocket offensive collapsed. But here is the part that nobody expected. After performing what military historians would later call one of the most extraordinary acts of individual heroism in World War II. Garland. Merle Connor went home and told absolutely no one. For 53 years, the second most decorated soldier of the entire war kept his medals in a cardboard box at the back of his closet. And the reason he stayed silent reveals something about courage that the military never taught and Hollywood never shows. This is Part 3. The story of what happens when a hero refuses to be remembered. The battlefield fell silent at approximately 10:30 on January 24, 1945. Connor walked back to the American foxholes on legs that barely functioned. 3 hours in frozen earth had locked his muscles. His joints moved like rusted hinges. A medic examined his shoulder and found shrapnel embedded just below the skin. Small piece, Lucky, the medic said. Connor did not feel lucky. He felt empty. The intelligence section went forward after the German retreat to count the dead. They found 53 German bodies in the immediate impact zone. Another 78 wounded soldiers had been left behind when the Germans withdrew. The actual casualties were higher. The Germans had dragged many of their dead and wounded back toward their own lines during the retreat. Final estimates put total German losses at over 150 killed and wounded. All 6 Tiger tanks were destroyed or abandoned. 4 had been immobilized by artillery damage. 2 had been abandoned after catastrophic track failures. American recovery teams would salvage the wrecks, later strip them for intelligence study, the armor and fire control systems. 3rd Battalion had lost 11 soldiers, killed 23 wounded. Most of the casualties had occurred during the initial German artillery barrage before Connor reached the ditch. After he began directing fire, American deaths stopped almost completely. One man with a telephone had changed the mathematics of the entire battle. The battalion commander recommended Connor for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork went up through division, through corps, through army. But the award process moved slowly, and Connor was being rotated home. 28 consecutive months of combat, 7 wounds. The army decided he had done enough. On March 15, 1945, Connor left France. He sailed from Le Havre on a transport ship and arrived in New York 3 weeks later. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. Connor was already stateside, already trying to figure out how to become a civilian again. Instead of the Medal of Honor, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor. The citation described his actions in detail, volunteered to run 400 yards through enemy fire, directed artillery for 3 hours from an exposed position, called fire on his own position when Germans closed to within yards, killed 50 enemy soldiers, stopped 6 Tiger tanks, saved his battalion. It was enough to make him famous. Connor made sure it did not. Albany, Kentucky, held a parade for him in May 1945. The town wanted to honor their returning hero. Alvin York spoke at the ceremony. York was the most famous Medal of Honor recipient from World War I, a Tennessee boy from just 50 miles away who understood what men like Connor carried home from war. Connor stood in front of his neighbors and listened to officers read his medal citations aloud. He did not speak about what he had done. When people asked him later about the war, about France, about that frozen morning in January, he gave them the same answer every time. He said he had left those memories across the Atlantic Ocean. He would not bring them home. At the parade, Connor met a woman named Pauline Wells. She was 20 years old. She had heard the stories, heard the citations read aloud, and she could not believe that the quiet 5'6" farmer standing in front of her had done what the officers described. Connor did not try to convince her. He did not talk about the war at all. They married on July 9, 1945. They moved to a farm on Indian Creek, several miles north of Albany. No electricity, no running water. They worked the land with mules and horses, growing tobacco and corn the same way Connor's family had grown crops for generations. Pauline asked him once early in their marriage what had happened in France. What had he done to earn all those medals? Connor looked at her and said he had done what needed to be done. That was all there was to it. He would not elaborate. He never elaborated. The medals went into a cardboard box. The box went into a duffel bag. The duffel bag went into the back of the living room closet. Pauline knew the medals were there. She had seen them once. The Distinguished Service Cross, 4 silver stars, Bronze Star, Purple Hearts, the French Croix de Guerre. But Connor never displayed them, never mentioned them, never wore them to veterans' events. He became president of the Clinton County Farm Bureau and held the position for 17 years. He helped other farmers with crop rotation and soil conservation. He worked with the Paralyzed Veterans of America and the Disabled American Veterans, traveling to nearby counties to help veterans file claims for benefits. He spent decades helping other soldiers get the recognition they deserved while keeping his own medals hidden in a closet. The men who had watched him in that ditch grew old. Some of them died. The ones who survived remembered what they had seen, but Connor never contacted them. He never attended reunions. He never wrote about January 24th, 1945. The story should have disappeared into history. Another forgotten act of heroism in a war full of them. But in 1996, a stranger knocked on Connor's door looking for information about a dead man. And everything changed. Richard Chilton was researching his uncle, Private Gordon Roberts. Roberts had been killed at Anzio in January 1944. Chilton had learned that Roberts served in the same unit as a soldier named Garland Connor. He wanted to know if Connor remembered anything about his uncle's final days. Connor invited Chilton inside. They sat in the living room of the small farmhouse. Connor was 77 years old, diabetic, kidney failure. He had maybe 2 years left to live. Connor told Chilton about Anzio, about Roberts. He had carried Roberts to a medical aid station after Roberts was hit by shrapnel. He had stayed with Roberts until he died, held his hand, told him it would be okay, even though both of them knew it would not be okay. As Connor spoke, he began to cry. 52 years later, and the memory still broke him. 52 years of silence and the grief was still fresh. Pauline suggested that Chilton look through Connor's military records. Maybe there would be information about Roberts in the files. She brought out the duffel bag from the closet. She brought out the cardboard box. Chilton opened it, expecting to find paperwork. He found medals, rows of medals. He found citations, pages of citations describing acts of valor that read like fiction. His hands started shaking as he read. He looked at Connor, then at Pauline, then back at the medals. He said one sentence that would launch a 22-year battle. This man should have been awarded the Medal of Honor. Chilton began the process immediately. He filed paperwork with the Army Board for Correction of Military Records. He gathered eyewitness statements from men who had served with Connor soldiers who had watched him in that ditch for 3 hours. Men who had never forgotten what they saw, but had no way to contact the quiet farmer who had saved their lives. He built a case for upgrading the Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor. The board rejected the application in 1997. They said too much time had passed. They said the evidence was insufficient. They said the eyewitness accounts were unreliable because the witnesses were old and their memories might be faulty. Chilton appealed. The board rejected the appeal in 2000. Connor died on November 5, 1998. He was 79 years old. He was buried in Memorial Hill Cemetery in Albany with the Distinguished Service Cross that should have been a Medal of Honor. But Pauline did not stop. Her husband had refused to fight for recognition. She would fight for him. Pauline collected more eyewitness accounts. She found 3 soldiers who had been in the foxholes on January 24, 1945. Men in their 80s now, but their memories were clear. They remembered the ditch. They remembered the telephone wire. They remembered watching shells land within yards of Connor while he kept calling fire. They remembered thinking they were watching a dead man. They remembered being wrong. She resubmitted the case in 2008. Nothing happened. Historians supported the upgrade. Authors wrote about Connor. Stephen Ambrose called his actions far above the call of duty. The Rhode Island Senate passed a resolution in 2005 calling for the Medal of Honor. 7 retired generals endorsed the application. Still nothing. The Army bureaucracy had rules, time limits, procedures that did not account for men who refused to seek recognition for themselves. In 2014, Pauline did something that no one expected from an 85-year-old widow from rural Kentucky. She sued the United States Army in federal court. The judge ruled that she had waited too long. She appealed to the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. The case went to mediation. During the proceedings, something remarkable happened. The government attorney assigned to argue against the Medal of Honor broke down crying in the mediation room. Her father had served in 3rd Battalion. He had been wounded on January 25, 1945, one day after Connor's action. She told the mediator that Garland Connor might have saved her father's life. She could not argue against the upgrade. The Army Board finally recommended the Medal of Honor in 2015. Congress passed legislation waiving the time limit. On March 29, 2018, the White House announced the award. On June 26, 2018, President Trump presented the Medal of Honor to Pauline in the East Room of the White House. She was 89 years old. 22 years had passed since Chilton opened that cardboard box. 20 years since Connor died without knowing his country would finally recognize what he did. The citation was read aloud in the East Room. First Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. Pauline held the medal in hands that shook with age and emotion. The medal her husband never sought. The medal he kept hidden for 50 years because he thought talking about it would be bragging. The second most decorated soldier of World War II, after Audie Murphy. A man who saved an entire battalion by calling artillery on his own head. And almost no one had ever heard his name. But this story has one more chapter. Because the question of why Connor stayed silent, why he hid his medals, why he refused to speak about the most extraordinary day of his life, reveals something about heroism that changes everything we think we know about courage. And that answer waited in a cardboard box for half a century. In Part 1, a Kentucky tobacco farmer ran 400 yards through German artillery fire with nothing but a telephone. In Part 2, he called shells onto his own position for 3 hours, destroying 6 Tiger tanks and killing over 150 enemy soldiers. In Part 3, you learned that he hid his medals in a cardboard box for 53 years and refused to speak about the most extraordinary day of his life. His widow fought for 22 years to get him the Medal of Honor he deserved. She succeeded. But this story has one final chapter that almost no one knows. Because the question everyone asks is wrong. Everyone asks why Connor was so brave on January 24, 1945. The real question is why he spent the rest of his life pretending it never happened. And the answer to that question changes everything we think we understand about heroism, about courage, and about the men who come home from war carrying weights that no metal can measure. This is the final part. And it begins with a secret that Garland Merle Connor took to his grave. Connor returned to Kentucky in the spring of 1945 as one of the most decorated soldiers of the entire war. 4 silver stars, a Distinguished Service Cross, Bronze Star, Purple Hearts for 7 separate wounds, the French Croix de Guerre. He had survived 28 consecutive months of combat across 4 amphibious assault landings and 10 major campaigns. The Army calculated that a frontline infantry soldier had a statistical life expectancy of approximately 90 days in continuous combat. Connor had beaten those odds by a factor of 9. He should have been a celebrity. He should have written books and given speeches and toured the country telling his story. Instead, he went home to a farm with no electricity and no running water and started growing tobacco again. He married Pauline Wells 2 months after the war ended. They built a life together on Indian Creek, working the land the same way Connor's family had worked it for generations. Pauline learned quickly that her husband did not discuss the war. She learned that certain sounds made him flinch. Thunder, backfiring engines, the crack of a rifle during hunting season. She learned that he sometimes woke in the night with his hands reaching for a telephone that was not there. She learned that the quiet man she had married carried something inside him that he could not name and would not share. Connor never attended a reunion of the 7th Infantry Regiment. He never contacted the men whose lives he had saved. He never responded to letters from military historians asking about January 24, 1945. When reporters occasionally found him seeking interviews about his remarkable service record, he turned them away with the same quiet explanation. He said those memories belonged to the men who did not come home. He said talking about what he did would be like taking credit for surviving when so many others had died. He said the real heroes were buried in France and Italy and North Africa, and the last thing they needed was a farmer from Kentucky pretending he was special for doing what any of them would have done. The medals stayed in the cardboard box. The citations stayed unread. The stories stayed untold. Connor poured his energy into helping other veterans instead. He worked with the Disabled American Veterans Organization for decades, traveling to neighboring counties to help soldiers navigate the bureaucracy of benefit claims. He sat with men who had lost limbs, and men who had lost their minds, and men who had lost their faith in everything. He listened to their stories. He helped them get what they were owed. He never told them his own story. He never explained that he understood their nightmares because he had nightmares of his own. But the truth was simpler and more devastating than anyone knew. Connor did not hide his medals because he was humble. He hid them because he felt guilty. The soldiers who died in 3rd Battalion's foxholes on January 24, 1945, died before Connor reached his ditch. They died in the initial German artillery barrage while Connor was still in the command post. They died while he was running across 400 yards of open ground. If he had moved faster, if he had anticipated the attack, if he had positioned himself forward before the Germans launched their offensive, maybe those 11 men would have survived. Maybe the 23 wounded would never have been wounded at all. Connor knew this was irrational. He knew that no one could have predicted the exact timing of the German attack. He knew that his actions had saved hundreds of lives that would have been lost if he had not picked up that telephone. But guilt does not respond to logic. Guilt finds the crack in your armor and pours through it like water through stone. Connor spent 53 years believing that he should have done more, that the men who died were his responsibility, that their families deserved a better intelligence officer, a faster runner, a smarter soldier who would have figured out how to save everyone instead of just most of them. This is what heroism looks like when the cameras are off. This is the weight that men like Connor carry. The knowledge that they survived when others did not. The question that never stops asking itself in the darkest hours of the night. Why me? Why did I live when they died? The legacy of what Connor did on January 24, 1945, extends far beyond a single battle in a forgotten corner of France. Military historians have studied his actions as a case study in forward observer tactics in artillery coordination under extreme conditions, in the psychological factors that enable individual soldiers to perform beyond any reasonable expectation. The doctrine of calling artillery on your own position, which every manual said never to do, became a recognized last resort tactic precisely because of what Connor proved was possible. In the Korean War, American forward observers facing human wave attacks would remember Connor's example. In Vietnam, soldiers surrounded by enemy forces would remember that survival sometimes meant bringing the thunder down on your own head. The principle Connor demonstrated that one man with communication equipment and the will to use it can multiply his combat power beyond all proportion, influenced the development of combat controller doctrine in the Air Force, forward air controller procedures in the Marines, and joint terminal attack controller training across all services. Every modern JTAC, who calls close air support danger close, traces their lineage back to men like Connor, who proved that precision and courage could overcome impossible odds. But the deeper legacy is not about tactics or technology. It is about the nature of courage itself. We tell ourselves stories about heroes because we want to believe that ordinary people can become extraordinary when the moment demands it. Connor's story proves this is true. A tobacco farmer with no high school diploma became the second most decorated soldier of a global war. But we leave out the other half of the story. We leave out what happens after the hero comes home. We leave out the nightmares and the guilt and the silence that stretches across decades. We leave out the cardboard box in the closet and the wife who learns not to ask certain questions. We leave out the truth that heroism in one moment can become a burden that lasts a lifetime. Connor did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a survivor, and survivors carry the weight of those who did not survive. This is why his story matters. Not because he destroyed 6 Tiger tanks, or killed 150 German soldiers, or saved an entire battalion from annihilation. His story matters because it shows us what heroism actually costs. It shows us that the bravest men are often the quietest men. It shows us that the medals in the cardboard box represent something far more complicated than simple valor. There is one final detail that almost no one knows. When Pauline Connor accepted the Medal of Honor at the White House on June 26, 2018, she was not alone. Sitting in the East Room that day were three elderly men in their 90s. They had traveled from different parts of the country to be there. They had not seen each other in over 70 years. They were the last surviving soldiers from 3rd Battalion who had been in the foxholes on January 24, 1945. They were the men who had watched Connor in that ditch for 3 hours. They were the men whose lives he had saved. After the ceremony, Pauline met with them privately. They told her stories about her husband that she had never heard. They told her about the moment they saw him running toward the German advance with a telephone. They told her about the moment they realized he was calling artillery on his own position. They told her about the moment the German attack collapsed, and they understood that one man had saved them all. One of the elderly soldiers wept as he spoke. He said he had tried to find Connor after the war to thank him. He said he had written letters that were never answered. He said he had spent 73 years wondering why the man who saved his life never wanted to hear from him. Now he understood. Connor had not been avoiding gratitude. He had been avoiding the memories that gratitude would awaken. He had been protecting himself from the weight of his own heroism. The three old soldiers had brought something with them to the White House. A photograph taken on January 25, 1945, the day after the battle. It showed Connor standing in front of the ditch where he had spent 3 hours directing artillery fire. His uniform was torn. His face was covered in dirt. His eyes had the hollow look of a man who has seen too much and survived anyway. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 3 words in faded pencil. The man who. That was all. The man who. The sentence was never finished. Perhaps the soldier who wrote it could not find words sufficient to complete it. Perhaps the man who saved us all was too simple. Perhaps the man who should have died was too honest. Perhaps the man who carried this weight for the rest of his life was too painful to write. Pauline took the photograph home with her. She placed it next to the Medal of Honor in a new display case that replaced the cardboard box. For the first time in 73 years, Garland Merle Connor's medals were no longer hidden. For the first time, his story was being told. For the first time, the man who never wanted to be remembered was being remembered exactly as he should be. Not as a hero who felt no fear, but as a human being who felt everything and did it anyway. From a tobacco farmer who never finished high school, to the man who saved an entire battalion by calling artillery on his own head. From a cardboard box in a closet to the Medal of Honor in the East Room of the White House. From 53 years of silence to a legacy that will outlive everyone who witnessed it. Garland Merle Connor proved that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is picking up the telephone when everyone else is frozen. Courage is running toward the enemy when every instinct screams at you to run away. Courage is calling fire on your own position because the alternative is watching everyone around you die. And perhaps most importantly, courage is carrying the weight of what you did without asking for recognition, without seeking praise, without needing anyone to tell you that you mattered. Connor knew he mattered. He knew because 11 men were still buried in France, while hundreds of others grew old and had children and grandchildren, and lives that would not have existed if a 120-pound farmer had not walked out of a command post with a telephone and 400 yards of wire. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are thousands of forgotten heroes from every war, men and women whose cardboard boxes have never been opened. Their stories deserve to be told. And somewhere in a cemetery in Kentucky, a man who never wanted to be famous is finally being remembered for exactly what he was. The man who